So as we just celebrated Veterans Day this week, I've been doing a lot of thinking about being thankful to others that have served, that have went out and did. Thought a lot about showing appreciation to other people, and really just been putting a lot of thought into like service, just service in general, just serving others. And I keep finding myself coming back to the book of James. And my wife's not up here, so I'm going to tell you, we're going to be looking at one word today. And she knows that anytime I'm ever in a service and the pastor's like, I got one word today, I'm always like, for real? We've only got one word? But for real, we've got one word today that we're going to look at specifically. So if you've got your Bibles, and I hope you do, go ahead and open to James chapter 1. We're mainly going to be looking at verse 27. And specifically, as I said, we're going to focus on one word in verse 27. Now, I'm not dumb, so I know what I'm going to say is going to sound kind of weird. In the original language, we're going to be looking at one word. In our language, it's been translated to 2 or 3 words. So first, before we dig into James, I want to make sure we understand the context of the book of James. The book of James paints a pretty practical, a pretty clear picture of Christianity, and basically that picture looks like faith in action. People living out their faith. They've got a faith, and because of that faith, they're doing something. And to break that down even farther, James basically says if you really have faith in Jesus, then the result of that will be the types of things that he talks about are the things that will just naturally come out of you. There'll be an overflow from that faith. And those things will be present as a result of that faith in your life. So let's go ahead and read in James. We're actually going to start in verse 22. So James 1:22. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Because if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like someone looking at his face in a mirror. For he looks at himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of person he was. But the one who looks intently into the perfect law of freedom and preserves in it, and is not forgetful hearer, but a doer who works, this person will be blessed in what he does. If anyone thinks he is religious without controlling his tongue, his religion is useless, and he deceives himself. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Okay, the verse we're going to focus on is verse 27. And what we're looking at is religion here. True religion. And true religion isn't just a monotonous, superficial act that we do. And I say a couple big words there intentionally. Superficial. Have you ever had a kid and you went to the doctor and your kid's like bleeding all over the place and you take him in and the doctor's like, oh, it's just superficial. We'll get to him later. And you're like, what do you mean? Like, right? It's superficial. And what superficial means, textbook, is that it's something that's concerned only with what's obvious or apparent. It's shallow. It doesn't go very deep. Superficial means that something that's only seen on the surface. The inside doesn't really see it, only the outside does. It means that nothing really penetrates past the outside, so it's external. So it's shallow and it's external. And superficial means presenting only an appearance without substance or significance. Kind of like Halloween when somebody paints one of them fake big old nasty bleeding scars on them. It's the appearance of something, but it just peels right off and there's nothing underneath of it. So basically something that's superficial doesn't have any lasting real effect. It's about as close to being fake as you can get without saying it's fake, right? It maybe still hurts a little, it maybe still looks nice a little, but it's not deep. It's shallow. It doesn't change anything. It's just close to fake as you can get without saying fake. So according to these verses, true religion isn't just routine, monotonous, superficial acts. True religion isn't just hearing truths in here or somewhere else on a Sunday morning. True religion isn't participating in religious activities this day and this day and this day during the week, but instead, true religion is the genuine expression of the truth and the love of God to other people. This is what God calls religion that He sees as good. That's why when we come to James, in verse 27, James says, "Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this." What James is saying there is that this is what the religion that is acceptable before God looks like. He says, I'm fixing to tell you, religious people, what religion that God actually accepts, what that looks like. And I don't know about you, but whenever I read a statement like that, that gets my attention. Like, whoa, I need to pay attention here. And really, my flesh, my fleshly person says, everybody needs to pay attention here, right? Like, we need to open our eyes, we need to listen to this. So let's read all of verse 27 again to see what this religion that God says is acceptable looks like. It says, "Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to look after orphans and widows and their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." All right, so I told you we were going to focus on one word. And actually, in the original language, like I said, this is one word. It has one meaning, but it's a couple words here in our language. So the word we're going to look at is right here in the middle of verse 27. Here it is, right here. Here is the word. It's a verb. And it actually is one word, like I said, in the original language. But here, and if you've got your own Bible, you might even underline this word, because this word is important. There's a lot of meaning to this word, to look after. This is a really interesting word in the original language. In the original language, this is one word, and this word is used a lot in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And I've even made the joke to people that, we talk about being religious. I'm like, religious is looking after the old ladies and the kids that don't have moms and dads. But that's shallow, right? Think of how much we see hurt and need now that we didn't used to see. We've got Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and all these things. And we see more hurt than we used to. And it's so easy to not actually look after, but to just send a quick, "Hey, I'm thinking about you. I'm praying for you." Is that what James says religion looks like? Does James say religion is to send positive vibes and thoughts and prayers their way? No. He says to look after. So we're going to dig into this word. This word, look after, and I can't pronounce it in the original language, either Greek or Hebrew, so I'm not even going to try this morning. But basically, it's a word that means to visit someone, but not visit someone like what normally comes to our mind. Like when you visit someone, you go to just sit down, have them give you a glass of water, talk with them for a little while, and then you leave and go home. Instead, it means to visit someone with the intention of caring for them and looking after them. This isn't like I'm going to go visit somebody and then I'm going to be on my way. It's more like I'm going to go visit somebody and I'm going to fix whatever is wrong that I can fix while I'm there. I'm going to give my time to them. I'm going to care for them. And it's a visit where you go to somebody that's in need and you just take responsibility for their needs. Now, there's not a lot of men here today, so I can say this and nobody's going to grumble. But the guys, whenever they go to visit the in-laws, more than anything, there's always needs there that need to be, and they go to grumbling like, "Arr, arr, arr." We need to go to those needs and, hey, what else is broke? What are you not telling me? Right? I've got a lot of ladies that I know in my life that when I go and they're like, "Oh, I don't want to tell you about this next thing or that next thing," and it's like, "Well, I'm here. I'm here. Tell me. Let's work on that." So in a nutshell, this word to look after means to go to someone and take responsibility for them. That's a whole lot different understanding than just to look after. just to visit. This is to go to them and to own what's going on there, to take that on your shoulders, like to bear that burden with them and for them. This is sounding more like church, right? So religion that God our Father accepts as pure and undefiled or faultless is to go to the orphans and widows. And not just to visit them, but take ownership, take responsibility for their needs. And the orphans and widows here represent people that have needs that they can't meet on their own. They don't necessarily have to be a lady whose husband is no longer there. They don't necessarily have to be a child that doesn't have a parent in the picture. But these are people that can't meet their own needs. And we're told that we're to go to them with deep concern and actually care for them. That takes our time. That's hard to do. That's harder to do than to send a message, a text. I don't know if anybody here really knows me, but if you know me and there's any communication much going on between us at all, usually I will call and then you won't answer and then I'll send the text message, right? So I know that in the world we live in, we'd rather just send that quick message. But look, people need people. People want people, and especially people that are in need. They want people. They want somebody there, breathing, living in front of them, helping them. That actually changes things in our life other than just that message. Not that messages are bad. I'm not saying messages are better than nothing, but actions. Faith and action is what the book of James is all about. So this is the kind of religion that God says, or that James tells us that God the Father accepts. So what I want to do is I want to show you a few different places this word, this same word that means to look after in our Bible, exactly the same word. So I'm not like a scholar, but I've got some computer programs, so I can click on a word in the original text and it'll show me everywhere else in the Bible where that word is used. So don't think I'm smarter than I am. I've just got a computer program that helps me with this. So I want to show us some places where we see this same word, and I hope that'll let us understand more clearly what this passage in James means. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go all the way to the beginning. Actually, we're going to go to the end of the beginning. If you get my joke, that's Genesis chapter 50. The first book, last chapter. And as we go to these different places, if you've got your own Bible, you might underline these spots and make your little note out to the side that says James 1:27 out to the side. That way maybe later on, some months, some years, some decades from now, you're reading somewhere here, and I'm telling you, at different points in your life, God's Word will speak to you in different ways. And if you're reading in some of these other places and you see this underlined, you're like, oh, wow, I see the character of God in a fresh new way today. And then underlined is this word, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, James 1:27, what's that? So later on in life, you see, good morning. You see James 1:27 underlined there, and now that you've had your eyes open to this character of God in a new way, you go, oh, wow, that's for me too. So you might underline these things. So first one, Genesis chapter 50, verse 24. This is at the end of Genesis, and what's going on here is Joseph is fixing to die, and he says to his brothers, hey guys, I'm about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid. And there's the word, come to your aid. Same exact word in the original language used in James 1:27, that's translated over there as to look after. Here in Genesis is translated to come to your aid. So Joseph says God will come to your aid and will bring you up out of this land he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God, and here it is the second time, same word that we're talking about this morning, when God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. So what Joseph is saying here is he's fixing to die. As soon as this happens, Joseph knows that as soon as he dies, they're going to start wondering what is going to happen next. They're going to wonder, what's going to happen to us next? Much like the widow or the widower. Whenever their significant other dies, they find themselves wondering what's going to happen next. And Joseph looks at them and he says, hey, God's going to come to you and he's going to look after you. He's going to take responsibility for your needs. God's going to show up and he's going to care for you with deep concern. So don't be afraid. So that's the meaning that we get here from Genesis, is to look after. That same word here explains that this is how God does for his people. This is the character of God that we see. God comes to his people and shows great concern for them. This happened early on in Genesis. Adam and Eve, whenever they first sinned, what happened? God came looking for the sinner. And now their need that they just realized that they were naked. God met that need and made them some clothing, right, to cover themselves up. Whenever we are in need, God shows up. Now he don't, like you notice Adam and Eve, God didn't like send a tweet down or send a text message to them. He came. He came to that need. So the meaning that we get from to look after here in Genesis is that just that. It's to show up to meet that need. Now, I want to take you kind of to the middle of the Old Testament here, the book of Psalms. Psalm 8 specifically. We're going to look at one at the beginning of the Psalms and one at the end of the Psalms. And I'll put this up on the screen. But again, you might underline this here. Psalm 8, again, this is talking about the character of God whenever we see this word to look after. And the word is in verse 4, but we're going to start in verse 3, so we've got a little context here. So listen to Psalm 8, starting in verse 3. It says, whenever I observe your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you set in place, what is a human being that you remember him? A son of man that you, here it is, look after him. You might underline that there. Maybe put a little note, James 1:27. God, with all his greatness, the God that hanged the moon and hung the stars and all these things, like God's got going on. Just think about how busy we are. Think about God, right? God's got a lot going on, but he still comes to look after his people. He still shows this deep concern. He shows up in his greatness to provide for those that are in need. Same idea over in Psalm 106, near the end of Psalms. Again, we'll start a little bit before where the word's at. That way we can get the context. We'll start in verse 2. This is talking about the greatness of God here and the salvation that God brings to his people, much like in Psalm 8. And listen to what he says there in the 106th Psalm, starting in verse 2. He says, who can declare the Lord's mighty acts or proclaim all the praise due him? How happy are those who uphold justice, who practice righteousness at all times. Verse 4. Remember me, Lord, when you show favor to your people. Here it is. Come to me with your salvation, so that I may enjoy the prosperity of your chosen ones. Right here. Same word. Same exact word that we're talking about. Literally, the psalmist is saying, look after me. Care for me. Take care of me when you come to save your people. This psalmist is more than likely David, but he's crying out to God, God, whenever you come for your people, take care of me. Tend to my needs. And so in the Old Testament, when we see this word used, what we've got is this picture of God, a God that looks after his people, a God that visits them. I don't want to say this over and over again, but not a God that sends a Facebook message or a text message, but a God that comes to his people. We don't do that anymore, guys. People don't do that anymore. And when you do show up, a lot of times, the lights are off. They text you, what do you need? I need you to open the door, right? I want to visit. But what we see in the Old Testament is that God come to his people, and I understand that in the Old Testament this was more acceptable back then, right? 20, 30 years ago, we know when we went to people's house, they were excited for company. How many people do you know that aren't excited when God shows up in their life? They're like, oof, that just makes me uncomfortable. It's like when we show up at their house, they're uncomfortable enough. When God shows up in their life, they don't want to talk about that stuff. They're not comfortable with that. But this is the God that we see. This is the character of God that we see. God comes to his people. He visits his people. He comes to them in their time of need. He takes responsibility for their needs. And then we come to the New Testament. Go ahead and be turning to Luke chapter 1. If you're using your Bible. If not, you can see up here on the screen. But what happens is in the New Testament is Luke uses this word that we're talking about today more than anybody else. He uses it in Luke, and then he uses it again in Acts, but he uses it a lot. And Luke picks up on this idea of the Old Testament, of this word to look after. This idea of coming to people, of God coming to people to care for them and provide for them and to meet their needs where they are. So Luke 1, verse 68. This is Zechariah, and he's giving praise to God. And he says this in Luke 1, verse 68. He said, "Blessed is the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has," here's the word right here, "he has visited and provided the redemption for his people and come to redeem them." Now, literally, this word here means he is looking after them. He has visited them to save them, to redeem them. Now, whenever we think about this, we think, well, I can't save nobody. You read this book, you can. You bring the message of life with you when you come to someone in need. God working through us. When you go to someone, you visit them. Don't get so wrapped up. It's so easy, especially in outreach ministries, to get wrapped up in meeting that physical need. That it's hard, it's challenging to bring up the spiritual need. And though Jesus met physical need everywhere he went, he wanted them to realize that it was the spiritual need that was the biggest in their lives. So literally here, this word means to look after, to visit them, to redeem them. Same thing we see down in verse 78 of Luke. It says there, "Because of our God's merciful compassion, the dawn from on high will visit us." That word, visit us, same word, same exact word. Make that little note there. His mercy will visit us. His mercy will look out for us. Can you imagine being that person in need? Knowing that there's good, religious people out there that have religion that we see in James, God says is acceptable before him, and you're the one there at home thinking, man, I wish someone would come and reach out to me and have mercy on me and show mercy into my life. That word visit us is the same word in James. So make a note there. Now we're going to go over to Luke 7. Maybe we're going to go to, I don't think I put Luke 7 down. It's actually Luke 7, verse 16. I forgot to put that one down. And what I want to do here is I want us to see how this word is used to describe God through Jesus. Listen to this in Luke 17. This is the crowds responding to Jesus. And here's what they say in verse 16. "Then fear came over everyone." Is that what you guys have got? Making sure I didn't have something wrote down. Okay. "Then fear came over everyone, and they glorified God, saying, 'A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people.'" Has visited. That's the same word we've been talking about. They're talking about Jesus here. They're talking about Jesus, and they said, God has visited his people. That "has visited" is actually one word in the original language, and it means to look after, to come to, and to help. God has looked after his people. He's come to his people. That word here, it's just crazy. I kept coming back to this word this week as I was thinking about Veterans Day and service and people that came to others to meet great need. I kept thinking, Jesus came to meet our need. The greatest need we ever had, he came to meet us right where we're at. So they're talking about Jesus, and they said, God visited his people. So if you're wondering where this is going, and where this is going is, I want you to get the whole picture of what this word really means. That way, whenever we read that in James 1:27, we don't just take that and go, oh, to visit. I need to go visit the orphans and the widows, and my religion will be good and acceptable before God. Because that's not just really what it means. And they don't just mean to go pop in and say, hey, how you doing? Smells funny in here. I'm going to go. No, that's not what it means. Right? That's not what it means. I want us to think about the practical implications here of this word and what Scripture's teaching us that our character should look like because of what God's character looks like. Luke wrote another book called Acts. In Acts chapter 7, verse 23, this is Stephen, and he's before the Sanhedrin at this point, and he's recounting the history of the Old Testament. He's talking about Moses. You remember Moses, right? Moses, this dude that grew up in the Egyptian palace, and then he left. He left from the Egyptian palace, and he was all on his own. And he's got this chance at this point, whenever he leaves the palace, to go wherever it is that Moses wants to go. He is, by all circumstances, free to make his own decision at that point. But instead, he goes back to Egypt to help the Israelites. He goes to help the Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt to get out of Egypt. And he went back there at a great risk. Why? That's what we're going to see here. Stephen says in verse 23, when he, Moses, was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. That word right there is the same exact word as in James 1:27. Now think about how this changes how we should understand that verse in James. Moses didn't just decide to go say, hey, what's up, to the Israelites. He didn't go to just spend a little holiday vacation there and then leave and go back where he came from. Instead, Moses went there to care for them. He knew that he belonged to them people. He knew that they were his people and they belonged to him and he belonged to them, and they shared a common destiny. And so Moses, he went to them and he took responsibility for these people. He went to them and he took his life and he just said, whatever else I was going to do is sidelined now, because I'm going to go to these people and I'm going to show concern for them and I'm going to meet their need where they're at. Then over in Acts 15, we're about done. We ain't got many more to go to. We see a very similar thing being expressed in the New Testament church. This is the last one in the book of Acts, and we'll see one more. So Acts 15, verse 36. It says there, I know you're still turning, but it says there, after some time passed, Paul said to Barnabas. Now remember, Paul and Barnabas at this point had been going around planting all kinds of churches in all kinds of different places. They've been leading people to Christ. And Paul says to Barnabas, he says, let's go back and visit. There's the word. Let's go back there and visit. Same word, James 1:27. Let's go back and visit the brothers and sisters in every town where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. So Paul says, Barnabas, let's go to these guys, and not just to say hello and have tea, but let's go to these people that we've led to Christ and these churches that we've started. Let's go to them and help them. Let's go provide for them. Let's go show great concern to them. Let's go and take responsibility for them. We need to see how they're doing. They're in distress. We know they are, because everywhere we've been under distress. So let's go to them and let's provide for them. Let's care for them. Last one I want to show you this morning is in Matthew 25. We're going to start in verse 31. The word we're looking at is actually going to be found in verse 36. Let's look at these words and let these words of Jesus soak in to us. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, just as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick,' here it is, 'and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or without clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will answer, 'Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" So, what I want you to see here is that Jesus takes this word, took care of me. And I know it says right after that, when I was in prison, you visited me, but that's not the same word. That doesn't mean the same thing. Whenever Jesus says there, I was in prison and you visited me, that means like a, "Hey, how you doing? Can't stay, sorry. Just wanted to check on you." That's a different meaning over there. But whenever it says, "You took care of me," that's the same word as in James 1:27. And I want us to see that Jesus says here to visit someone, to come to them, to take care of them, to look after them, to take responsibility for that need. And he says, when you do that for the sick, when you look after the sick, when you go to the poor, when you go to the hungry, when you go to those that can't do for themselves, when they're in prison, when they're hurting, when they're alone, Jesus says whenever we look after them, we're looking after Jesus. That's a huge statement for Jesus to identify himself with the sick and the hungry and the poor and the imprisoned. But he does that. And what's super interesting about this word is that this word also has antonyms. That means opposites. I just wanted to throw that antonyms out there. But that this word that we're looking at, to care for, to go to look after, has opposites. And the opposite of that, looking after someone, is to forget someone. Young people, believe me, your grandparents want your time. And whenever you don't go to them, in their minds, you've forgotten about them. Christians, the people in this world that are in need, that are hurting, when we don't go to them, they think we've forgotten about them. Intentionally forgotten about them. The opposite of going to someone to care for someone is to willingly and completely forget about them and neglect them. It's how it feels, it's how it looks, because it's the truth. So today, I want us to realize what this one word in the New Testament is teaching us. This one word is teaching us that apparently God, in his own character, is concerned about looking after his people and coming to his people to care for them. This is the character of God. This is the heart of God. And he's saying that religion, true religion, that's good and acceptable, is religion that goes to the neediest to care for them. And then that also means that the opposite of true religion is religion that forgets those that are in need and neglects those that are in need. The sick and the hungry and the poor and the orphans and the widows. And I'm not going to church bash today, but how many churches are so focused on what keeps them comfortable and what feels good for them and what's going on in their lives and the meals and their fellowship with their church family, that they forget to go to the needs.
That's right.
That's not good religion to have.
Nope.
So this begs the question, does the church today have true religion or false religion? Do you have what James would describe as religion that is acceptable before God and pure and undefiled? Do you know what Jesus is saying in Matthew 25? Listen to this. He says, when you go to those in great need, that you are providing for him, that you're caring for him. Jesus says, whenever we go to those in need, we meet Jesus there. We are serving Jesus. That's a huge statement, right? Think about that. People say, wait a minute, I thought we were Jesus and we were going to and we're supposed to. I've told y'all before, I think Jesus has got this whole thing rigged. Whenever we do what we're supposed to do and we take that character of God, that if we're saved, if we've got Christ in us, that character of God that's in us that goes to, that don't just send a message and don't just send a thought, but goes to that need to care for them. And when we go to them with the character of God in us, we meet Jesus there and care for him as we care for his people. Jesus says when we help the sick and the poor and the orphan and the hungry, we're helping him. That's amazing. And also what that means, church, is that if we want to be with Jesus, if we want to be with Jesus where he is, remember back a few weeks we were talking about in Hebrews about Jesus was outside the camp, that we need to go outside the camp. Jesus is outside the camp. And he says whenever we go to those places where he's at, all this ties together. He says whenever we go there, to those places where he is, we will be where Jesus is. We will serve him. We will do his will. Because that's where Jesus is at. Jesus is where the greatest needs are. So if we want to be where Jesus is at, we've got to go to the great needs, regardless of where they are. And not just to visit, but to care for them. And when we do that, we'll meet Jesus there as we serve him. And the best part of this is that when we do this, Jesus is the one that gets the glory for all of this. That's right. He's the one that's glorified and not us. So at this point, we're going to prepare to observe the Lord's Supper. And in doing that, I just want to take time to remember and reflect on the fact that Jesus came to us in our greatest need. He came to people in their greatest need to provide, to care for, not just to visit and leave. He came to take care of us and meet our needs, because he met our greatest need by giving his life on a cross for us. Amen. Romans 3, verse 5 through 11 says, "For while we were still helpless, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly." You can put your name in there. Whatever your name is, you can say, "For while Jeremy was still helpless at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly." For rarely will someone die for a just person, though for a good person perhaps someone might even dare to die. But God proves his own love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. How much more then, since we have now been justified by his blood, will we be saved through him from wrath? For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, then how much more, having been reconciled, will we be saved by his life? And not only that, but we will also boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received this reconciliation. Christians, this is grace. This is God's grace. He came to us in our great need to meet our need where we were. And God says true religion is this, is to go to others and their great need and meet that need where they're at. So at this time, just so there's no like questions floating around in the air, I'd like to say that if you have put your faith in Jesus, if you have put your faith in the work that Jesus did on the cross, that Jesus is God made into man, He came to earth, He died on the cross for the sins of the world, and that includes yours, and that He was buried, and He rose from the grave 3 days later. He didn't stay dead. Short story there. He rose back up to make us have an opportunity to be right before God. If you believe that, then you are welcome to take the Lord's Supper with us. Paul, in Corinthians, I didn't write this down. In Corinthians 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says these instructions. Every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you are announcing the Lord's death until He comes again. So anyone who eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord unworthily is guilty of sinning against the body and the blood of the Lord. That is why you should examine yourself before eating the bread and drinking the cup. For if you eat the bread or drink the cup without honoring the body of Christ, you are eating and drinking God's judgment upon yourself. So what we're going to do is, for the next few minutes, I'm going to give us some time for self-examination. And we're going to have a song, and the kids are going to come out. So just take this time to think about your life. Think about what was provided for you. Think about the great need of yours that was met. And if you need to take this time to deal with God, do that as we get ready to take this Lord's Supper.